Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Experiential Realism. Before I start talking about aliens, the Fermi paradox, quantum physics, altered states of consciousness and other topics of interest, I would just like to mention that my friend Matt Gray has recently released a brilliant and incisive soliloquy on near-death experiences, referencing Dr. Bruce Grayson and Jeffrey Long. Like me, he is impressed by what the evidence from NDE cases appears to be pointing to, even mentioning an NDE case that I have never come across. He also mentions that he's never met anybody, as far as he's aware, who's had an NDE, but I did comment on his video that he knows me, and although I don't consider myself to have experienced an NDE, I have apparently experienced something similar once, and I think I've mentioned it before in a previous video. The reason why it's not appropriate to describe my experience, which I had about 20 years ago now, as an NDE is because I only collapsed and never required medical attention. I was young and stupidly decided to intoxicate myself with copious amounts of skunk weed and alcohol. I also hadn't eaten and ended up collapsing in the toilet of the Undercroft pub on campus at Westminster University, right in front of a urinal. Suddenly, I perceived myself to be tucked in this white cloud and feeling profoundly peaceful, without a care in the world. The next thing I know is that I am floating above the heads of people drinking and smoking in the pub, so perhaps it is more correct to say that I had an OBE, an out-of-body experience. So I am higher than all the heads in the pub and I can see everything and hear their chatter. I am also only a floating point of awareness with no thought of I or self, and pretty much fully absorbed in the experience. Perhaps this lends credit to Kastrup's lack of metacognition if in that instance I had no thought of self, and certainly not identifying with my human body. As I move in mid-air over the heads of students, I notice that my awareness is mouse trailing through space. Through that space, that particular pub space, as though moving from one frame of space to the next, like there are interruptions in continuity or disjointed positions in the sequence of movement, even though consciousness was a continuous stream and continues to be a continuous stream as always. Finally, I'm back in my body and lying on the floor with my head in this bloke's lap, feeling uncomfortable and disappointed that I'm me again. On top of it, the bloke is slapping my face several times and repeatedly shouting at me to wake up, so I muster the strength to block his slaps and weakly tell him that I'm okay. I'm subsequently escorted to the pub where my friends see me and get me a glass of water. The bloke who found me told me I had passed out next to the urinals and then left, and never said how long I was out for. I also never told my friends about my experience at the time. I was a materialist puzzled by my hallucination, or so I thought it was. I also remember thinking that the pub seemed to have just about the same number of people I saw in my experience, but I can't really claim to know exactly what happened in all honesty. And again, I wouldn't say it was an NDE because I wasn't near death at all. Excuse me. I never needed medical attention. So whether I hit my head on the floor and my brain's activity quickly diminished for a period of time, causing me to have an OBE, I don't know. I have also speculated in hindsight, of course, wondering if the mouse trailing movement was caused by the fact that the bloke was slapping my body repeatedly. It might even be feasible that every time he slapped my face, my conscious focus outside the body was disrupted. I don't know. Or perhaps that's how disembodied points of awareness move sometimes through a 3D construct. Again, I don't really know and I wouldn't claim to know. All I know is that it felt great and certainly better than how I was feeling prior to collapsing. Many hypotheses and many theories have come to mind, and I can only hope that one day they'll be scientifically testable, and I hope we don't allow our preconceptions and materialist beliefs about reality get in the way in the future, as they have done for so long. I have a lot to cover in today's video, and I'm already beginning to touch upon one of the topics I wish to discuss: science, our method of inquiry, and scientists, those of our species that investigate and measure features of our reality and record how nature behaves. Science is a wonderful method of inquiry, but sometimes scientists can give it a bad name by doing exactly the opposite of what they are supposed to do. A kind of corruption in the scientific community whereby arrogance often prevails over humility, and where seniors strive to save face and preserve their conventional theoretical models against novel ways of thinking, which are sometimes presented by their own students. We, as a species, are often unprepared to tolerate a radically new idea. Scientists can often act like know-it-alls, even if they claim sometimes to be coming from a place of humility, and they don't always make the best philosophers. Some pretense is exhibited in those moments where they speak as though everything has been sussed out. Like most human beings, they are error-prone and make assumptions about the data they come across, which can often be interpreted in a number of ways, quantum physics being an example. It is true that scientists often take in new ideas and apply them faster than anyone else, to some extent. But the new ideas they are willing to accept don't challenge their most cherished thinking. In their minds, to entertain certain unconventional ideas would be synonymous with thinking the unthinkable or overturning conventional thought which is contemporarily in vogue. Truly original thought takes a remarkably long time to displace the old forms. Einstein and Heisenberg, for example, were met with great resistance from other scientists, for the acceptance of relativity and the principle of indeterminacy meant discarding many cherished and ostensibly obvious ideas. Perhaps one day Rupert Sheldrake's idea of morphogenetic fields and his hypothesis of formative causation, where reality has acquired certain habits that cause animals and plants to keep on forming in the ways that individual species do, may even help to refine or amend the ideas behind neo-Darwinism. It's ironic that Charles Darwin is now almost deified by the scientific community, in stark contrast to how he was first received by his peers. And dare saying, in this day and age, dare saying Darwin was wrong raises eyebrows or begets outright ostracism. Critical opprobrium of Dr. Sheldrake was published in the prestigious science journal Nature under the rubric "A Book for Burning," with a question mark at the end. Sheldrake was, at the time, treated like a heretic by a scientific community religiously rejecting radically new ideas, and we still have a scientific community that has a tendency to dismiss ideas that challenge its accepted beliefs. So it's not surprising that when a strange interstellar object like Oumuamua invades our solar system, scientists used conventional astrophysics to formulate outlandish theories, such as the object being made of nitrogen ice crystals wrapped in a hydrogen cloud with invisible outgassing, to account for its weird shine and non-gravitational acceleration as it left our solar system. This angered the theoretical physicist and Harvard professor Avi Loeb, who wrote an article detailing 6 anomalous properties of Oumuamua that make it unusual, unlike any comets or asteroids seen before, and founded the Galileo Project for the systematic scientific search for evidence of extraterrestrial technological artifacts, which was also inspired by the release of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence report on unidentified aerial phenomena, or UAPs. As displayed on the project's website, their aim reads, given the recently discovered abundance of Earth-Sun systems, the Galileo Project is dedicated to the proposition that humans can no longer ignore the possible existence of extraterrestrial technological civilizations, or ETCs, and that science should not dogmatically reject potential extraterrestrial explanations because of social stigma or cultural preferences, factors which are not conducive to the scientific method of unbiased empirical inquiry. We now must dare to look through new telescopes, both literally and figuratively. Dr. Loeb takes seriously the possibility that Oumuamua is an artificial thin solar sail which could possibly be collecting information from planetary systems in our galaxy. One of the drawbacks of the closed nature of the scientific community is that if the field of inquiry is neglected by scientists for any reason, research in that area will be rejected or abandoned. And I've already spoken in previous videos about the example of Bell's theorem. It remained untouched, unexamined, untested for decades, since the 30s actually, because people thought that Einstein had to be absolutely right about hidden variables. And then lo and behold, when John Clauser found Bell's theorem at a local library, he contacted Bell and asked him if his theorem had already been tested, to which Bell replied no. And John Clauser began his experiments in the early 70s, and then after so long, lo and behold, they proved that hidden variables don't exist and local realism is false. You know the story, as I've mentioned before. So science, in this sense, is subject to fashion, since no scientist can really work in isolation from his fellows, no matter how dedicated they are or how good their ideas are. And I challenge anyone to oppose me on this. It's absolutely true what's going on in the scientific community, and has been going on for so long. It's always been the case. An individual scientist always depends on the approval and criticism of other scientists. From the outside, of course, it can seem very different indeed. Caution and a regard for professional ethics are necessary conditions of good research, and are admirable indeed, but they can all too easily appear to be the arrogance of an elite that is interested above all things in protecting its own interests. So, while there is every reason for scientists to approach new advances in knowledge with caution, it might also be sensible for them to treat temptation to reject the unusual or the bizarre with a similar degree of inhibition. Pardon me. And sometimes fairly accurate knowledge about reality comes from the most unexpected sources. The kind of knowledge about the structure of matter as revealed through extrasensory perception, which was eventually unravelled by modern physicists using costly and sophisticated technology. I'm going to tell you a story now. In the 19th century, Annie Besant and Charles W. Leadbetter, two theosophical clairvoyants, I don't know if you know the story, used ancient Indian yoga techniques to study the ultimate nature of matter over a period of 40 years. The Indian guru who taught them the techniques claimed that the mind can focus anywhere, be it the very large and remotest regions of the universe to the very small, and apprehend the roots of this reality. The idea of viewing atoms using ESP was, and still is of course, rejected by orthodox science. If you are not using an electron microscope, why should anyone take you seriously? Why should people believe that your visions are revealing something objectively true and aren't just dreams or hallucinations, right? And yet, their Micro-psi exercises produced a complex model of the subatomic world which would eventually be confirmed by modern science with a great degree of accuracy. The vast amounts of information they produced seemed to bear no relationship to the findings of chemists and physicists during those 4 decades. But science is always revising itself and amending itself. And it was only in the 1980s where resemblances were noticed between their descriptions and the modern theory of the structure of fundamental particles, way ahead of scientific postulation and way ahead of the scientific community. Besant and Leadbetter apparently recorded the nature of quarks as the building blocks of matter, using only yoga meditation to obtain knowledge of the subatomic world. In the ancient Yoga Sutras, the sage Patanjali lists psychic abilities which, according to Eastern tradition, can be cultivated by yoga meditation. One of them is the power to gain, and I quote, knowledge of the small, the hidden, or the distant by directing the light of a superphysical faculty. So to acquire knowledge through alleged micro-psi abilities under the tutelage of Indian gurus, that is confirmed by conventional science only many years later, is perhaps the most convincing type of ESP, extrasensory perception. In the case of Besant and Leadbetter, there is no possibility that the psychics had access to normal sources of information. It was the 19th century, and they published pictures of what they claimed were hydrogen, nitrogen and oxygen atoms present in the air in the year 1895. What they saw was also confirmed by later clairvoyance using micro-psi in the late 1950s. As each scientific picture of the atom was discarded and replaced by the next in the scientific community, Besant and Leadbetter continued to produce remarkably consistent descriptions of their micro-psi atoms, which at no time bore any resemblance to those of the scientists. The two theosophists observed that in certain elements, for example the gases neon, argon, krypton and xenon, and the metal platinum, the atoms were not all identical. This anticipated the scientific realization that chemically indistinguishable variants of an element could exist, having atoms of different masses. These variants came to be called isotopes. The complex shape of the micro-psi atoms that the psychics came up with also corresponded to the scientifically recorded atomic weights on the periodic table, some of which were unknown at the time, as there were more gaps on the periodic table. Chemists such as E. Lester Smith, the co-discoverer of vitamin B12, pointed out the discrepancies between the descriptions of micro-psi atoms and the knowledge of chemical atoms, as they claimed that hydrogen with an atomic weight of 1 had 18 ultimate particles, what the psychics called quarks. But then someone pointed out that in its normal state, hydrogen does not consist of single atoms. It consists of parts of atoms tightly bound together, making up a hydrogen molecule, which, I don't know if you did this at school, but it makes up a hydrogen molecule which is the smallest quantity of the element to exist under ordinary conditions, which were the conditions in which the psychics found themselves in. And with the advent of the quark theory in 1964, it was found that the molecule indeed contains 18 subquarks, lending credit to the psychics again. Moreover, the diagrams of the psychics showing two intersecting triangular arrays, you can look this up, you can look their diagrams up and compare them to recent models of the atoms, each consisting of, so these triangular arrays, each consisting of 3 bodies, and each of these bodies in turn consisting of 3 particles, match the quark theory of Murray Gell-Mann and George Zweig, where quarks are composed of subquarks, where 3 of these linked by strings make up the higher order one in triangular arrays. It was also noted that any deviations from atomic numbers in the psychic's model was only between 1 and 6 digits, errors that scientists can also make as the result of miscounting. Besant and Leadbetter had overestimated the total number in the isotope of neon by 6, but in most of the discrepancies it was only miscounting by 1 or 2, which is venial considering that they were observing, according to the claim, a structure that was complex and shifting. So such small errors are only to be expected, really. A graph was drawn showing the number of protons and neutrons in the nuclei of atoms against the number of particles in micro-psi atoms. I urge you to look this up, to really Google it and look at this graph. And and it was found that the findings of the clairvoyants match very closely those of objectively verified reality. The psychics might as well have been scientists. They match closely. The lines are together practically. Besant and Leadbetter commented on the difficulties they had in stopping the motion of the constituent particles by psychokinesis. Leadbetter once said, and I quote, "The molecule is spinning. You have to hold it still, and then you have to be careful that you do not spoil its shape. I am always afraid of disturbing the things because I must stop their motion in order to give an idea of them." End quote. The graph I was talking about, the graph showing the number of particles in each atomic nucleus, a number approximately equal to the atomic weight against the number of particles in the micro-psi atom, is already impressive evidence that the clairvoyants were observing something objectively real. The structures described by Besant and Leadbetter bear a striking resemblance to modern string model theories in which subquarks are the ends of strings of magnetic lines of force. Apparently, Besant was responsible for observing how subatomic particles were bound together, while Leadbetter focused on the larger scale structures and requiring less magnification. And they were assisted by their collaborator and amanuensis C. Dasa, who recorded their descriptions as they made their psychic observations. They conducted their research over 4 decades, as I've mentioned before, while also managing the affairs of the Theosophical Society, and they also believed in reincarnation, interestingly enough. At the end of the 3rd edition of their book, Occult Chemistry, Jinaraja Dasa remarked, "With the information revealed in occult chemistry, a great expansion of our knowledge of chemistry lies in front of us. It is just because this expansion is inevitable that our clairvoyant investigators have toiled patiently for 30 years. They have claimed no recognition from chemists and physicists because truth accepted or rejected is truth still, and any fact of nature seen and stated clearly will sooner or later be woven into the whole fabric of truth. The fact that this generation of scientists hardly knows anything at all of an extraordinary work of research extending for 30 years matters little when we contemplate the long vistas of scientific investigation which the imagination sees awaiting mankind." End quote. Today, anyone who investigates their clairvoyant research will find its intrinsic scientific merit, as it reveals a remarkably high degree of consistency with ideas and well-established facts of nuclear and particle physics. Without knowing what they were observing, they described the subatomic world more than a century ago, and scientists and laypeople alike may find their claims difficult to believe, but they cannot dismiss them as fraudulent because their work was completed many years before pertinent scientific knowledge and theories became available to make a hoax possible, even in principle. Nor can they honestly reject these claims as unsupported by scientific thought, for the very opposite is true. Do we say now that it was impressive guesswork for the sake of resisting entertaining the idea of ESP as a possible explanation? Besant and Leadbetter also related the structure of the Anu which is the Sanskrit word they used for atom, to the ancient Jewish mystical doctrine of the Tree of Life, a chart of reality that includes the material universe and its microcosm, the human body. The tree is based on 10 sephiroth, or emanations, the 10 stages in which God manifested himself in creation. Masculine qualities are placed on the right, feminine ones on the left. They are combined and reconciled in the central sephiroth. The highest is Keta, the crown or Godhead, giving rise to Chokmah, or divine wisdom, and Binah, which is divine intelligence. A gulf separates this supernal triad from the lower sephiroth. Hesed, or mercy, is a constructive loving principle, contrasted with Geburah, which is severity, which is associated with destruction and war. These two are united in Tiferet, or beauty, representing the life force and symbolized by the sun and by the heart. Next come Netzach, meaning victory, representing instinct, the passions and forces of attraction, and Hod, or glory, standing for imagination and also for reason, which is viewed as a negative quality. Yesod, or foundation, is linked with growth and decay. The moon, which links the sun and the earth, and the genitals. Malkuth, or kingdom, is matter, the earth, the body. To Besant and Ledbetter, the three major worlds of the Anu corresponded to the supernal triad, and the remainder to the lower seventh Sephiroth. What I find very interesting is the Ein Sof at the top, representing the infinite source, which in Kabbalah is understood to be God prior to any self-manifestation in the production of any spiritual realm, and expresses Neoplatonic thought, which was probably introduced in Jewish mysticism by Azrael of Girona, who once said that God has no desires, no thoughts, words or action, the negation of any attribute. Ein meaning nothing and Sof meaning grasped, so nothing grasped. The Godhead is the luminary, a primordial light that shines directly from Ein Sof. This light, the origin of all creation and all lower lights, is called the Or Ein Sof, or light of the infinite, according to this belief. Through God, knowing himself, he created everything. Or means light, and Timtum is contraction, constriction, condensation, which limits Or Ein Sof, the infinite light of the Godhead, in order to allow for a conceptual space in which the four worlds or finite realms could exist. Timtum is only the illusory concealment of the Or Ein Sof, giving rise to monistic panentheism. Timtum enables a finite perspective, a kind of restricted knowing of personal unified experience. My friend Nini Castle pointed out that the origin of the word consciousness is conscientia, which means with knowledge in Latin, and she points out that it implies the coming together of shared knowledge. In fact, the word science is in conscientia, and science is indeed a method that we use to gather knowledge or information about reality. It's a tool used by humans through which the universe comes to know about itself, at least about its own behaviour, and it is through this behaviour, which can be measured, that it has acquired the anthropic perspective. And, of course, humans are only one way of scratching at the surface towards knowing thyself. We add to the cosmic intelligence, so I don't think the etymological connection between both words is accidental. It may be why Rupert Spira sometimes refers to consciousness as the knowing. The moment something makes an appearance in your field of awareness, you know about it. You know of its existence, whatever the nature of its existence may be. Things can only be known in consciousness and consciousness can conceptually and experientially divide itself into the following trinity: knower, knowing, and known. And one of the most profound aims in this existence, but it doesn't have to necessarily be the only one, is to know thyself, and in spite of conceptual distinctions which convey a sense of reality, ultimately there is only knowing. This is why we can achieve anatta, the no-self state, if we want to. We may currently identify with our bodies and our thoughts, but the perception of having a body can fall away, along with the self-narrative or the story of who we are, and yet something remains as pure, unadulterated, irreducible knowing. The knowing remains because it's the only possible ontological ground. It is the very ground of existence, the pure I am that I am, prior to any story. It knows itself as it is knowing itself, and it is in its nature to know. Pardon me. If we ask who is knowing, then confabulations begin and conceptual realities are born. But none of the narratives made of finite concepts across time by finite sentient beings can ever truly capture who or what that knowing is. The infinite whole will always be more than its conceptualized finite parts. And all sentient beings remain blind to what they truly are at the core of their being. They were that knowing all along. There is a quote attributed to Bruce Lee, which goes like this: "There must be a being instead of a doing in training." So reading this quote, it's effective because, after all, when you train in martial arts, you are trying to be better. It's about becoming. When one does anything, one must become the act if the act is to be carried out effectively, because merely doing the act implies a separation from it and therefore not fully embodying it or becoming acquainted with it. There is a kind of non-duality conveyed by the quote. And consciousness is the ground of all being. It is clear that nothing can be said to exist without consciousness, as said before many times. And consciousness is non-computable, irreducible, and dimensionless, yet capable of conceptualizing multiple dimensions, which include the three we are familiar with as human beings, plus time. So consciousness is pregnant with potential from the outset because, as the ontological primitive, it precedes all the known laws of physics. In scientific jargon, laws are not really laws. They refer to manifest restrictions once a world of rules is conceptualized. In the beginning, if there were no laws, there were no restrictions. I've said this to Professor James Tartaglia before. If there were no laws, there were no restrictions, and if there were no restrictions, everything possible is permitted. Consciousness was unrestricted ab initio. We must also bear in mind that primordial consciousness isn't human-like consciousness. It's a mistake that many people make. It's a common misconception. Primordial consciousness is prior to that and has equal potential to become a plant, an amoeba, a hominid, a reptile, or even an extraterrestrial life form. Through meditation, it is possible to glimpse that pristine cognition, where what it is like to be human, which is a finite formulation, falls away, where human ego dissipates. It's a pristine cognition stripped of all concepts, where you practically cease to be anything other than awareness, where thoughts don't exist, which is why one always has a hard time conceptualizing it after the fact. It's hard to describe a state of mind which is unlike anything that is experienced as a human being, because one doesn't identify as a human in that state. This is known as henosis. but has different names in other traditions. It has also been called the Rigpa state. As I said before, consciousness is the only logical primitive because nothingness is only an abstraction and doesn't exist by definition. The ground is therefore dimensionless, but not nothing. It is radiant like an eternal uncaused sun, which transcends space and time. So the world wasn't actually created ex nihilo. It was created, if we're going to use the Latin, de conscientia, out of consciousness, or more precisely, in conscientia. The universe thus being an idea in mind, and most likely, hence idealism, and most likely one of many. This is consistent with cosmogony and physics, as we know that a state of nothingness is extremely improbable, that one would have to say impossible, and that the possibility of something arising is infinitesimally high. Something that the likes of Lawrence Krauss and Nick Holt have stated and admitted that the nothingness they have been talking about isn't really nothing. Because if it were, then they would have a major cosmogonic problem, as you can't get anything from true zero. Logic. The laws are restrictions which the light of consciousness blinds itself to, with which the light of consciousness blinds itself to its infinite potential in order to identify as something finite, like a version of an entropic world such as ours, and also sentient creatures such as ourselves. Out of one comes the illusion of diversity and finiteness. In order for the one consciousness to do this, it needs to forget its omniscient potential and forget its transcendent reality. But even through the identification with finite beings, it can still recall its transcendent nature, because the link is never severed, for it can't really be other than itself. The world out there is real in a sense, but it is also an illusion of sorts. It is phenomenally real. In fact, only consciousness is real, and the forms perceived in the universe, including our bodies, are only dreamed. Hence why nothing in this universe lasts, and why we strive to create order out of chaos. The mind at large is in constant flux, as it defines its collapsed derivative of itself, hence the law of impermanence that Heraclitus pointed out. Only the truly real is still and eternal, which is pure consciousness. It's uncaused and unchanging. The illusory, on the other hand, is a mind in flux, the minding of concepts, plots and dreams where one can get lost amidst transient appearances. But the world is still special because it provides many meaningful opportunities when consciousness identifies as sentient beings in a perceived world of rules. It's similar to the reason why we play games, and more. The opportunity to be brave in a dangerous world, the opportunity to love others despite our flaws and imperfection, the opportunity to create from incompleteness and use our imagination and intuition to do things. It's self-evident why it's special. I don't know about a multiverse, as there isn't one shred of evidence for it other than what mathematics suggests, but it is clear that a play manifested and we are able to derive meaning and purpose from it. And meaning in particular is an extra layer of reality that tends to be overlooked in academia and should be explored. When I tripped on psilocybin for the first time, I saw a bird descending from a tree to pick up a twig on the ground before flying away. I found this deeply beautiful and full of meaning. I suddenly found myself paying attention to something that prior to the experience would have been deemed trivial. In hindsight, the psychedelic trip showed me that there are flavors of consciousness highly appreciative of things that most would find insignificant. It was a discovery about what my own personal consciousness can do when altered from its default human mode. So, before you presume what consciousness can and can't do, try to explore your own personal mind and you might get a clue about universal consciousness. Some people also seem to think that consciousness, especially cognitive scientists, many of them, that consciousness exists in different degrees like a spectrum, with absolute consciousness on one end and unconsciousness on the other. But I tend to disagree with this. You may be conscious of different things and to different degrees at any given time, but this relates to the contents of consciousness and not consciousness itself. The field of awareness remains regardless of its contents and how strongly they represent themselves. Consciousness remains regardless of focus. Consciousness itself isn't a spectrum because you are either conscious or you are not. So consciousness doesn't exist in different degrees of strength or presence in different creatures, which would be dissociated alters of the mind at large. It's not true. It doesn't exist like that. They are all equally conscious, the alters of the mind at large, all creatures. They are all equally conscious, but just aware of different things in different ways, and some are metacognitive, meaning their screen of perception allows for the phenomenon of sapiens sapiens, creature that knows it knows, whilst others have no focus of being aware. A dog may be less aware than a human in terms of what it can comprehend about reality. For example, it has no concept of quantum theory, but it is also more aware of spectrum of rich smells that can be perceived in reality than a human is. Dogs can also hear better than humans, so the claim that they are less conscious is false. We also have no idea what it feels like to be an amoeba or a tree, so I wouldn't make claims about that either, especially when recently it has been noted that forests hide an intricate network of connectivity akin to a brain, and there may be other senses of an arboreal nature that we are not even privy to. The experience of things is the experience of consciousness itself adopting different forms, not necessarily that consciousness experiences things outside of itself which could give rise to it, which is the nonsensical physicalist proposition. If you are conscious of dreaming in your sleep, does it mean that dreams exist outside consciousness because they are the experience of things or appearances? No. The brain is not some object with standalone existence outside consciousness and generating it any more than the dream generates the dreamer. The dream is only an appearance in a personal mind, just as the world is an appearance in the universal mind. And the way we perceive the universe is through our human senses, which make up a unified representation. There are no particles in physics, by the way. We've known this since the advent of quantum electrodynamics, since Richard Feynman in the 1940s. We we talk about particles now as a metaphor and a simplification for lay people. We have now extended quantum mechanics in such a way as to be consistent with Einstein's theory of relativity, and we reconciled both of them through quantum field theory. The so-called elementary particles are only patterns of excitation in an energy field. So, as you can see, the ripple doesn't even have a standalone existence. There is only just a field. And here is where we see that constitutive panpsychism is wrong in the metaphysical context. It's not that there are subatomic particles like billiard balls that are proto-conscious and come together to form the unitary experience of human consciousness. Actually, consciousness is there from the outset and includes all experiences. It's, as my friend Stephen Wallard has said before, it's pan-experiential in its potential and can include even the experience of what the field looks like to us with our human screen of perception, as it were, with all its properties, including space and time, which are also only appearances in awareness. Some might still argue that Bohmian mechanics still preserves a literal concept of standalone elementary particles, but I would point out that the reason why Bohmian mechanics isn't popular today is that it has proven itself to be irreconcilable with the theory of relativity. In order for reconciliation to happen between the two, and any other theory for that matter, we must speak of fields, and it destroys that existential premise that Democritus hypothesized, which materialists held dear for so long, atomism. And hence why they've decided to call materialism physicalism. Is more convenient now, because now it includes forces and fields and everything else. Unlike constitutive panpsychism, idealism entails a kind of phenomenalism. Space and time exists in spaceless and timeless consciousness, and not the other way around. This is the understanding that Donald Hoffman entails in the Markovian dynamics of conscious agents. The infinite conscious agent, or one consciousness, begets the world of representations and its projected dynamics, which include increasing entropy and an arrow of time from the Big Bang. And mathematical descriptions, active inference, Markov blankets and boundaries can be derived. There are many factors that can influence a magnetic field and magnetism itself, such as electric current, material shape, distance between objects, etc. And there are different types of magnetism derived from electromagnetic activity as defined by the interaction of electrically charged particles that create fields, if we choose to talk about reality in this way, and none of what's been said regarding parts and wholes and monism contradicts science, which is what materialists tend to think in discussions about metaphysical idealism. Science is merely a method of inquiry that explains how things behave and records patterns and regularities in nature, as Castro puts it, which prompts us to frame findings in terms of cause and effect and make predictions. That's it. Physics is a study of the pixels, so to speak, on the human screen of perception. But when we try to understand what we truly are from an objective perspective, we fall short. It just goes to show that the subject, as pure awareness, can identify with absolutely anything, the brain being an example. I could be a tree dreaming of being a moving person for all I know. There's no end to the possibilities in philosophy. I've had dreams where I felt like I was someone else and even had different memories, only to wake up and realise that that it was all a dream, and subsequently remember who I am supposed to be in waking life. The self-identity or human ego is an illusion anyway. It is a bundle of thoughts that make up a narrative of I, the human I. The real subject is pure, unadulterated consciousness. That's who we are at the core. In Buddhism, distinctions are made between samsara, the realm of samsara, and nirvana. The former is characterized by impermanence, suffering, and no self, in contrast to the latter, which is permanent. This is nirvana. The latter is permanent, without suffering, and a true self. So you see how this ties in with the evidence from NDEs. Perhaps nirvana is where we are headed, or what we come close to at death. Hence the feelings of bliss, oneness, and consciousness expansion reported by near-death experiences. Nirvana is the opposite of samsara, so it's logical that that in terms of experience they are different. I would contend that one can glimpse nirvana in this life before we kick the bucket. In fact, I believe it's possible to run the gamut of mystical experiences in the course of a human lifetime. Years ago, I stumbled upon a void in the hypnagogic state. Before I reached it, I heard chatter in my head, different voices, conversations in what felt like different places, as though I was tuning into different stations with my head, like a radio. All this was happening while I still felt myself lying in bed. This was soon interrupted by a thunderous sound, and I found myself in a dark void and felt at peace. Suddenly, there was a speck of light in the distance, and I was drawn to it. As it grew bigger and more luminous, I could see that it was shaped like a star. It radiated beautiful music, harmonious, melodious, and with a relaxed tempo. It was similar to Chariots of Fire by Vangelis. I was suddenly transfixed with wonder and great apprehension. The music made me feel like I had reached the end of the line, and that there was great compassion for having endured my life up until that point, like it was telling me it was already a great achievement. The luminous geometric star before me felt like a multidimensional portal and a point of no return. It was beautiful, and I was awed by it, so much so that its grace made me feel unworthy by comparison. I didn't feel like I had a body, but if I did, I would have prostrated myself in reverence to that star. My very existence appeared to taint its divinity. It occurred to me that I might as well not exist. This experience was so emotional that I was reduced to tears, as it were, but there was no sensation of crying. It was all deeply emotional. I also feared merging with it, because crossing this majestic Rubicon could mean the loss of everything I know and love on earth, and it particularly frightened me that merging with this star would make me love its light more than anything, to the point where I would forget about everything else. I was deeply curious about it, but also in no mood to explore it any further. There were a lot of emotions at once, and I wasn't ready. Not only was I facing something that felt divine, it was also a deep unknown. I didn't even know about the Merkaba back then, but I have been told that's probably what I experienced, and I still don't know much about the Merkaba, other than having taken a cursory look on Wiki and realizing that the star I saw certainly resembled it. This happened at a time when I was exploring the claims and beliefs of an online New Age community, and they were very much into astral projection. It was called Astral Viewers, and I used to go by the name of Summerlander. I was sceptical but not dismissive. My take at the time was that spiritual or mystical experiences must have their origins in something natural, either the product of brain activity or altered states of consciousness permitted by, or that, altered states of consciousness permitted the perception of other realms or spiritual planes of existence. I have had many interesting experiences in the hypnagogic and hypnopompic states, some of which resembled NDEs, even though they weren't brought about by extreme physical trauma. In fact, quite the opposite. I was practicing relaxation techniques as I found them useful for the induction of OBEs and lucid dreaming, techniques I found in Mind Games by Michael Powell. When I was younger, I used to try to induce OBEs for the sake of seeing more, like having a superpower, but now I have a more relaxed approach. I try not to let my ego overpower the exploration enterprise. If I alter my state of mind, it's more for the sake of exploring to see what my consciousness can do, to reveal its potential. For instance, seeing vivid colours and hyperreal qualities in lucid dream that are not observed in waking life, telling me that my consciousness or field of awareness can achieve certain appearances or percepts that go beyond what is common or typical. So being inquisitive without becoming addicted to it is a healthier approach. I also found that when I relaxed my lucid dreaming practice and forgot about strict methods, the more lucid dreams I had. Sometimes I have them when I least expect them. I could literally think I'd like to have a lucid dream and not do anything about it. A few years later, I find myself lucid in a dream, as though my subconscious delivered what was requested without obsession. And obsession is very unhealthy. So if you decide to practice lucid dreaming, you should have a relaxed approach always. And try and have fun. I look at notions such as out of the body as just another perspective now. I no longer place so much emphasis as much as I used to, because because now I understand that time and space are also just concepts or appearances in consciousness. They are real, but not in a strictly materialist sense, and certainly not fundamental. And now, when I think of the hard problem of consciousness in materialism, I'm reminded of something that Alan Watts said, and I quote, "Problems that remain persistently insoluble should always be suspected as questions asked in the wrong way." End quote. I also think of something I came across on Facebook to do with mindfulness. Pardon me. And I quote, "Thoughts passing by, but the space in which thoughts passing by stays forever. Watch that space. Be that. That's your consciousness." End quote. When I was discussing my Merkaba experience with Nini, someone mentioned Chris Bledsoe's UFO of God, which was like Ezekiel's vision of the chariot. UFO of God is really the chariot of God. Apparently, the Merkaba can also be seen as an army of angels in one. A 19th century fresco showing Ezekiel's wheel can be found on Google, which represents the angelic hierarchy in Judaism. It's very similar to the Olympic rings. You can check this out. And funnily enough, the Olympics is associated with the tune Chariots of Fire. Also, the precursor to the emblem, as it turns out, was by Pierre de Coubertin. I think that's how you pronounce it, it's French. But originally, the idea of interlaced rings was by Carl Jung, like the vesica piscis, or piscis, I think you pronounce it, vesica piscis, or bladder of the fish, which represents divine glory and is similar to the ichthys symbol for Christ. Now, it has been suggested that yesterday's angels and demons are today's aliens and UFOs or UAPs. But I don't think anyone truly knows what they are. Even if an abductee was told by the ostensibly otherworldly abductors that they are from another planet, we can't be sure that they are telling the truth. They could be a race of cryptids hiding in our oceans and wanting us to believe that they are extraterrestrial. We don't know. We don't even know for sure whether we are alone in the observable universe or not. The likelihood of life elsewhere depends on a number of factors, such as the conditions that make abiogenesis viable, which would be the process of dissociation from the mind at large. How often and how likely does mind at large dissociate from itself, which is always a partial dissociation. So, what are the conditions that make abiogenesis viable? How long it takes to evolve it to significant intelligence, meaning something that we can recognize to be intelligent, and also taking our and also talking about life as we know it should also be taken into account. The space hurdles that a Goldilocks planet has to surmount to sustain it long enough, and the propensity for intelligent civilizations to destroy themselves after discovering how to split the atom. All of that needs to be taken into account to try and figure out if we are alone, or how common intelligent life is out there. On a third round with Lex Fridman on his podcast, physicist Max Tegmark warned us about, I don't know if you've heard of this, the Moloch barrier as a possible explanation for the Fermi paradox. If we don't make it and perish as a species, it's because of Moloch, as Tegmark put it. Moloch is the urge that coerces individuals to compete with one another, inevitably leading humankind hurtling towards destruction with dangerous ideas. Ideas that at first appear to promise enormous payoffs, but they are poison. What is the answer to the Fermi paradox? Space is unbelievably vast and chock full of galaxies, so why don't we detect swarming fleets of alien spaceships? The reason why propositions are proffered in science for acceptance or rejection is a useful one to help us establish what is true about the reality we inhabit. There is no use in making assumptions, however intuitive they seem to be, when we have countless examples where nature has often proved to be counterintuitive. Jumping the gun on what is ostensibly sagacious or fanciful can also lead us to premature conclusions where there is a danger of confirmation bias by way of making the data fit the fallacious premise to the detriment of real information, and this requires a healthy dose of skepticism. This brings me to highlight hypotheses which speculate about extraterrestrial life. I could class aliens as quite probable in the universe because this one is unbelievably vast, and there are only so many ways in which matter can be arranged according to the laws of physics. And given the uniformity that has been detected about our cosmos, it isn't a great leap to suppose that there will be repetitions and similarities on a stellar, planetary, or even galactic scale. But I also wouldn't conclude that there is intelligent life out there for sure within our observable universe, apart from us, because it could be rare and by chance we could be alone. These are still possibilities, however counterintuitive, when we take into account the Fermi paradox and incisively elaborate possibilities put forth by geniuses such as Max Tegmark, who actually expounded upon the upon Everett's many worlds interpretation of quantum theory, creating a scenario of multiple universes where some are devoid of life whilst others are teeming with it. We could still live in one where we are the only ones and space is eerily quiet. We simply don't know, and it is best to be humble and reserve belief until it is truly justified. It is in line with epistemology. I'm sorry, but I wouldn't jump right ahead to belief, even though I am certainly inclined to believe that we cannot be alone given the cosmic immensity that surrounds us. I'm sure you can understand that there is always that possibility where perhaps we are not as justified as we think in our propensities and biases. Perhaps the solution to the Fermi paradox is that Earth is an early bloomer in terms of developing life. Another possibility is that Earth is one of the few potentially life-forming planets that overcame certain cosmological hurdles. Or life is everywhere, but everyone is inclined to hide. This is the dark forest hypothesis. I don't know. I really don't know what's going on out there. Where are the aliens when the universe is vast enough that we should have seen them by now? That's the paradox, right? If there are other intelligent civilizations out there in the cosmos, we don't even know for sure what they are like and what they are doing. When we posit that the solution to the Fermi paradox is that all life forms end up self-destructing at a certain level of intellectual maturity and technological scope, we are really projecting our own fears on the possibilities of outer space. We see what we have historically been like and what we continue to be like with our wars and nuclear weapons, that we as humankind, as an entity of little planet Earth, fear what we try to repress in ourselves. We fear the possibility of extraterrestrial greed and tyranny because we have witnessed the evil that men do here on Earth. In the assumption that alien life forms in space will be just like us in that assumption we form theories about them based on the darkness that we know we possess as a species, and thus fear being invaded by an extraterrestrial Christopher Columbus, where our planet is conquered like the Americas, or human domination is ended like the Islamic rule on the Iberian Peninsula during the Granada War in the 15th century, as our more advanced invaders won't respect what we stand for and our way of life. We fear being squashed like insignificant bugs from the higher alien intelligence perspective. And we fear that we might deserve it because of the way we currently are with one another and have always been for at least the past 300,000 years or so. Our tribalism continues and we obsess over minor differences between us with our prejudices. So what makes us think that we are even mature enough to mingle with a galactic federation out there? The picture you see on the screen is what I came up with when I was studying illustration at Westminster University, and Hayden Cottam, who was one of my lecturers at the time, briefed me to produce a front cover for War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. My depiction of an alien invader is grotesque and malevolent looking, as you can see. It's the stuff of nightmares, but when we consider the folly of our wars, the suffering that we visit upon members of our species, that's us. That's the Jungian shadow of humankind that we have not addressed. So we think everybody out there in space is the same. It certainly urges caution to suspect that alien predators travel through space with the intention of consuming the natural resources of other planets, but we should also look closer to home. We should introspect lest we completely become the very spacefarers that we fear the most in our hearts. Maybe the more we come to understand about reality, the more mature we will become as we progress and realize the unity of existence. Perhaps we will discover our true origins and outgrow our human consciousness in time. Michael Levin has talked about a Platonic realm that transcends spatial temporal dimensions as we collectively perceive them. In such a realm, eternal things are not static, despite being timeless. And timeless is what makes them eternal, for they have no beginning and no end. And if we imagine a passage of time which they necessarily transcend, Platonic forms would be true forever. And we are not just talking about the rules of mathematics here, but also ostensible paradoxes which can be conceptualized as oscillations comprised of diametrically opposed potentials for finite manifestations. And this is where Platonic forms are not necessarily static just because they are temporally transcendent. And the Platonic realm, according to Levin, is where minds could hypothetically hang out, unrestricted, as it is more loosely arranged, so to speak, more wholesome within the unified field of awareness, where paradoxes can even be resolved according to and depending on how they relate to other entities, and potentially forming infinite fractals of logic, and where more information is available that would conflict with what our reductionist left-brained perspectives would tolerate, and hence the reason why the filter that is the human brain exists, so that the finite human being isn't overloaded with information, for it would hamper its ability to survive. The human body only requires a tiny fraction of information relevant to it from the surrounding reality in order to adapt and survive. The Platonic realm, the more complete reality without restrictions, would be, in this view, experientially closer to the absolute. Maybe the Platonic realm is the timeless realm of the NDE and the afterlife, where the souls of the dead hang out. It could be that the people who are having life reviews in NDEs are the people who have had unresolved issues in the realm of empathy and compassion in the course of their lives. I'm not talking about a sense of unfinished business, which usually comes from a place of egoistic justice, or a sense of injustice through the eyes of an ego. The unresolved issues I'm talking about are dealt with in the NDE life review with the realization that we are all one mind, that monism is true, and the manner in which we affected others throughout our lives is felt from their perspective, thereby causing us to judge ourselves as we relinquish our human ego. And perhaps those who don't have life reviews have already dealt with those issues, or they are not ready to face them yet. Whatever the case, it seems that people judge themselves based on their actions. If they are accompanied by angelic beings or in communication with a bright light, there is no judgment from them. The only judgment would come from the NDE at the realization that their tainted human ego could have done things differently, as they are now able to look back or relive the experience and assess the situation from a mystical pedestal of unconditional love and profound bliss. Perhaps an encounter with divinity inevitably begets self-judgment, as we compare ourselves to that ultimate standard, and the very perfect nature of God inexorably leads to introspection of the self and assessment of the human ego. And some mystical traditions would hold that the ultimate realization is that we are God, the divine reality, Brahman, pure consciousness, the only reality. Now, what would psychopaths who have affected and destroyed many lives encounter at death? Hypothetically speaking, and some people may not like this, they would be welcome to the same level of compassion and unconditional love, but they would end up enduring the hell that they created for themselves upon a life review, because in a strong sense, what they did to others, they did to themselves. The life review in this scenario saliently appears to be the moment when the psychopath faces his karmic debt. The psychopath would also undergo the dissolution of his human ego as correlated by the dead brain representation on Earth or the destruction of the human body, but they would still face the mnemonic information and meaningful lessons of their human lives as recorded in the ether. And if lessons are not learned, they are bound to repeat a potentially infinite game with their attachment to an overinflated sense of ego, of egotistical self, where the inability to learn from one's mistakes resides and where there is no responsibility and accountability for one's actions. It's the hellish trap they made for themselves, as they forever play the victim to others and continue to idolize their imperfect human self, as though it is already perfect, as though it's already perfect, wholesome and complete, which is a lie. This implies that your stay in hell is determined by how long you refuse to see the light, this and the truth. This is redolent of Andy Weir's egg theory, where the universe is an egg where souls mature towards the Godhead. And perhaps that's where they started from, if only God, the ultimate awareness, exists. Instead of living multiple lifetimes until we have experienced from every single perspective, as the hypothesis suggests, we could, in fact, choose from an already present selection, from a dimension that is unbound, that is unbounded by space and time. And at the end of each life, we can potentially experience a life review where perspectival boundaries melt away, and we are also able to acquire the perspective of other souls we come across in the lifetime we just completed, thus expediting the process leading back to the source. So the life review could be a form of expedition, a form, where we get to kill many birds with one stone, as it were. Perhaps we have already covered many lives and will remember them all upon completion of the current one. Maybe we will remember that we were once a bug, a worm, a fish, a bird, a monkey, a whale, or even some alien creature on some other planet, or even a being in another dimension, and the source of reality, the absolute, transcends it all. It transcends space and time. There was a bit of a debate between Piers Morgan and Professor Richard Dawkins recently on Morgan's show Uncensored concerning the question, what came before the Big Bang? Dawkins said it makes no sense to ask that question if the Big Bang marked the very beginning of everything, including time. But he did admit that the notion that there was no before the Big Bang challenges human intuition. We can't help but imagine some kind of meta-time which contains the current temporal dimension that we perceive and possibly gave rise to. How can, in idealism, that's, we gave rise to everything practically, if we're the core consciousness. And how can there be nothing before the Big Bang, right? Especially when the very concept of nothing points to something that doesn't exist by definition, as I said before. So it's a mind-boggling pill that physicists are asking us to swallow. It's hard to swallow because we can't imagine time, nor space for that matter, having a beginning. Time itself seems to be more fundamental than that, or at least something that human consciousness clings to because, after all, storytelling relies on a sequence of events. We must also remember that sometimes even the best scientists aren't the best philosophers, and they can also be biased by notions of what they think reality should be like. For example, Einstein once tweaked his equations to accommodate the preconceived and erroneous notion at the time that we live in a static and eternal universe. Instead of following what the mathematics was telling him, he felt the need to introduce the cosmological constant, which he later came to regret and called it his biggest blunder. And much to Einstein's chagrin, it was the scientific Catholic priest Georges Lemaitre who calculated without bias that the universe was expanding even before the astronomer Edwin Hubble observed it. And Lemaitre also came up with the hypothesis of the primeval atom, a precursor to the Big Bang theory. Pardon me, Lemaitre, in my opinion, should be admired, not just for his accuracy, but also his epistemic perspicacity. When the Pope at the time tried to declare that Lemaitre's calculations were proof of a creator, Lemaitre said, "Not so fast. It's just evidence that the world had a beginning." Sometimes the best insights can come from the most unexpected places. Yes, Richard Dawkins is a great thinker, but sometimes common sense can come from laymen like Piers Morgan. And sometimes, and I know many people don't like him, but he did express the common sense that we all feel regarding a time before the Big Bang, a time before time. And sometimes scientists get philosophically lazy and just parrot each other's lazy reasoning and analogies that attempt to dogmatically preserve certain concepts like emergentism, as though this one is a one-glove-fits-all for anything they can't yet explain, like consciousness under materialism, where they liken it to the feeling of wetness produced by H2O molecules, which makes no sense, of course, because first, wetness is a sensation in consciousness, and second, hydrogen and oxygen atoms aren't wet. So it's like they are saying that consciousness doesn't really exist, a la Dennett's eliminativism, if wetness is analogous to consciousness, as an alleged epiphenomenon. There is a similar trend regarding the question of time before the Big Bang, whereby renowned scientists tend to parrot the same analogy in order to dismiss the notion of pre-Big Bang time, which I think was started by Stephen Hawking, who said, to talk, to quote him, he said, "To talk of before the Big Bang is like talking about going further north of the North Pole." Dawkins used this on Morgan, and I've heard others, such as the physicist Brian Greene and the astronomer David Kipping, use the exact same analogy. The problem is that the concept of north isn't anything like time, and the analogy itself conveys the sense of time when it imagines a scenario where people travel to the North Pole using a compass and then talk of going further north. And the cardinal points on the compass represent directions of travel for people to take and tell them which way they are facing. So the concept of north can be relative. One can talk of my north and your north, just as, say, my right or your left and vice versa. If we get rid of compasses and blindfold ourselves so we can't see where the sun rises and sets, we lose all sense of cardinal directions. But we can't do that with the passage of time. So one can say that the concept of north in the analogy is more abstract. We might even decide that the South Pole becomes the new north once we find ourselves in the Arctic. But if we insist that the Arctic is north, then we are already there. Then we just accept that and we wouldn't even think of further north. People don't ask what's north of the North Pole unless they're idiots. Much less think of that question as profound. But we can't say the same about the question germane to what preceded the Big Bang. It makes perfect intuitive sense to ask it. Time seems to be eternal. When we speak of a particular event in time, we can always imagine something that came before or after it. It's not like the cardinal directions, and this is where Hawking's analogy falls short. Time feels real to us in a way that the mere concept of north doesn't. Arriving at the northernmost point on Earth satisfies our quest for the north destination in a way that arriving at the alleged dawn of time in a bid to reach the remotest past does not. We can always ask what came before that, and what came before that ad infinitum. Contrary to the standard model of cosmology is Sir Roger Penrose's cyclic universe theory, which posits that the Big Bang was not the beginning of time or space, and that there are multiple phases of expansion and contraction that repeat indefinitely. Perhaps Penrose is getting closer to another possibility, that time itself is a loop, like the Ouroboros or even the lemniscate, the infinity symbol. Whatever the case, time seems to warrant infinite regress, and and space itself also appears to be boundless, as it makes no sense to speak of limited cosmic space. And what is our universe expanding into anyway? More space? My former college teacher and friend, who many years ago proposed a strange theory to one of my immature past selves, where everyone is a single consciousness observing from different perspectives. And he stated the following more recently. Time does not exist as we know it, as it would need a beginning, which makes no sense. Space does not exist, as it would need a boundary, which makes no sense. Material does not exist as we perceive it, as it cannot come from nowhere. Our consciousness is everything. I've realized that by attempting to fathom the nature of time and preserving an intuition about its passage, presupposing eternality, which appears to transcend the notion of objects, where movement in space is akin to a temporal illustration, I invoked Agrippa's trilemma, an epistemic regress problem once examined by Aristotle and Sextus Empiricus, that presents three justifications for believing in something: infinite regress, circular reasoning, and an axiom such as God or source consciousness. Excuse me. Piers Morgan, as a Catholic, commits the God of the gaps fallacy in opposition to an atheist like Richard Dawkins, whereas Dawkins appeals to the popular analogy that is used for that particular noetic gap, which is just as dismissively fallacious in the context of Agrippa's trilemma, where the unsupported belief that time itself began at the Big Bang cannot be questioned, for questioning it defies the allegedly inviolable proposition, even though it logically and intuitively begs the question of what came before. My efforts to answer the question led me to typical responses in philosophy that touched upon foundationalism, coherentism, contextualism, infinitism, and metaphysical idealism, where time is just a mental construct. NDE reports regarding the nature of time or temporal perception certainly seem to support the idea that time too is just a kind of appearance or felt sensation in consciousness. As you probably know from my previous videos, I've been researching NDE studies which have been published in major medical and scientific journals. Despite the prevalent materialism in the scientific community, it is undeniable that these studies weigh heavily in favour of an afterlife as permitted by nature. Plenty of evidence strongly suggests that the brain does not generate consciousness but filters it instead. And then we also have Pekindarian cases, which I mentioned in my last video, where near-death experiences in particular, they don't always happen in near-death experiences. They can happen in deathbed visions, but in near-death experiences, where near-death experiences encounter people they thought were still alive, only to find that they had died not long before their NDEs. So the patients also become privy to knowledge that they couldn't possibly have through conventional means. In fact, such NDEs were reported way before the modern studies that have been conducted. For instance, the Roman philosopher and naturalist Pliny the Elder, who authored Naturalis Historia almost 2,000 years ago and died in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, wrote about a nobleman called Corfidius who had been pronounced dead when he stopped breathing. Upon examining his will, they saw that he had named his younger brother as his inheritor, and this one hired an undertaker to arrange the funeral. The undertaker soon got the shock of his life when Corfidius sat up on the embalming table and clapped his hands to summon his servants before announcing that he had just come from his brother's house, where his brother told him that the funeral arrangements he'd made for Corfidius should now be used for him instead. The younger brother also asked Corfidius to take care of his daughter and showed him where to find some gold he had secretly buried in his garden. As Corfidius related this to a gobsmacked undertaker, the brother's servant burst in with the news that his master had unexpectedly died. The gold was also found, by the way, where Corfidius said it would be found, according to his brother in his near-death experience. There is also a more recent case reported by, and it was reported in the Huffington Post. The case was reported by Dr. K.M. Dale, where a nine-year-old boy called Eddie, who woke up in hospital at 3 a.m. after a severe fever that had lasted for almost 2 days and was closely monitored while he was unconscious. Eddie said he was in heaven, where he saw his deceased grandfather, his Aunt Rosa, and his Uncle Lorenzo. Eddie's father was embarrassed by what his son was saying in the presence of the doctor and dismissed it as a feverish delirium. But then Eddie went on to say that he had also seen his 19-year-old sister, Teresa, who told him he had to go back to the world of the living. And this upset his father, who then asked Dr. Dale to sedate Eddie. Eddie's father had just spoken with Teresa 2 days earlier, and as far as he was aware, his daughter was alive and well at her college 600 miles away. Later that morning, when his parents called the college, they learned that Teresa had died in a car accident just after midnight, and that college staff had been trying to reach them at their home. Like Corfidius and many others throughout the ages, Eddie knew more than he should according to the physicalist paradigm. It seems that a brush with death can be quite revealing. I have also noticed that quite a few people find themselves in green fields and valleys in their NDEs, and they often encounter beautiful plants and flowers, colourful and vibrant, and moving as though alive. An African-American man called Leron, in particular, described beautiful giant flowers in a field and felt their living energy, which made him feel welcome, peaceful and at home. Such experiences make me wonder if, as crazy as it sounds, these people were once plants, flowers, or even trees in past lives. I don't care if this sounds crazy. And if they were meeting their former non-human relatives in NDEs, who communicate through botanical images and living haptic information, or flora-like mental representations suffused with a meaningful connectivity and love. This might sound out there, but it has been noted that forests hide an intricate network of connectivity made of underground roots akin to dendrites in the brain, suggesting that forests could be conscious as one and many, a scenario redolent of Alice's Wonderland, where people, animals, and plants are alive and capable of communication. I'm going to leave you here with a lucid dream I had on the 8th of January 2021. I had gone to bed around 1:45, fell asleep and woke up at 6:25 in the morning. Then I returned to bed with the intention of having a lucid dream and encountering Morpheus as part of a plan of action. Bear in mind that just before Christmas of the previous year, I had that lucid dream I described to Robert Wagner about the Dennis the Menace character that looked like something out of a game, out of the game of Minecraft. And you'll see why there's a connection to this lucid dream. I'm about to recount this lucid dream for you, and it's connected to that because of the way the environment partially looked. Before I read from my dream journal, by the way, let me just, because I've just realised something, let me just give you a heads up about the terminology I've used to label the different states of mind I was in. I used the terms waking state or wakefulness, which is self-explanatory, meaning time in waking life. Dream state, which refers to regular or ordinary dreams, meaning non-lucid dreams. And finally, the phase state, which is the umbrella term used in Michael Raduga's School of Out-of-Body Travel to indicate a hybrid state of mind compounding waking consciousness and the oniric phantom world of the mind. So the phase state was a term employed by Raduga to prevent his students from arguing about whether their experiences were lucid dreams, astral projections, or genuine out-of-body experiences. Raduga was very pragmatic and focused entirely on techniques to induce altered states of consciousness instead of speculating about the nature of what was experienced. He didn't waste time with that, so that was his main focus. So because I used to work with Raduga in curating data from experiments, I had adopted the term phase state at the time to refer to lucid dreaming and apparent out-of-body experiences, because I was a materialist back then, like he was. I don't know if he still is. I haven't asked him. I haven't spoken to him. I only spoke to him, had an interaction with him recently via email about his recent experiments, and I did invite him on the podcast, and at the moment he can't do anything, but we'll see. Anyway, because I was a materialist back then, I used to call them autoscopic hallucinations. If we're going to get technical, we can refer to the neural correlates. The phase state is a peculiar hybrid brain state around the 40 hertz of gamma bandwidth of brainwave activity, which appears to compound waking consciousness and dreaming. Sometimes we simply called it the phase. Anyway, I'm going to read from my journal about my Morpheus phase experience, which I woke up from at 8:30 in the morning. Okay, so just give us a second here. Waking state. Upon my first awakening, I remind myself of my plan of action for lucid dreaming and use the loo. I return to bed and spend a few minutes relaxing and peering into the darkness behind my eyelids. Curiously, a random visual impression of moving a glass of water with my hand emerges in my mind, which causes my finger to twitch in reality. Subsequently, I fluctuate between wakefulness and shallow dream states. There is a vague dream involving a dialogue with Asian shopkeepers. Phase state. I find myself standing in the back garden of my house, and the gate is ajar. An old man wearing a brown cardigan is peeking in. I'm taken aback by the realism at first, but understand the situation to be hallucinatory. I see the old man slowly continuing along the pavement. I run up behind him and take flight above his bald head. Woohoo! I'm dreaming. I soar into the night sky in my excitement and plunge back to the earth at full speed. I must meet Morpheus. I'm lying in bed in darkness, but manage to vigorously rub my hands in front of my eyes until I see luminous digits. Okay. I keep rubbing them until the dark void materializes a scenery behind fully fledged hands. I walk through a mountain pass as though travelling through a Transylvanian mountain range, with dark green foliage on either side, leading to a little castle. I run towards the medieval structure until I reach its entrance. There are 2 massive doors and I knock on both. I step away for a second to examine a wooden gate with my fingers and notice that a patch of ground by the entrance to the castle displays a chess-like pattern which feels like marble to the touch. Looking up, in the distance, the horizon is concealed by a foggy, nighttime landscape redolent of Minecraft, with a hint of lunar light but no moon in sight. I draw my attention back to the doors and focus on the left one because its wooden surface is now displaying a vibrant red. I bang on the red door whilst shouting, "Morpheus! Morpheus! Are you there? Morpheus!" My voice echoes. The door finally opens to reveal a towering character resembling a cross between an Arthurian knight and a jester. His head and neck are covered by a helmet, and his pale, friendly countenance is marked by a distinct proboscis. "Are you Morpheus?" I ask him, as I rub my hands to prevent a premature end to this experience. "Well, yes, my child," comes the British reply in the sound of an old man's calm voice. "Come in." I step inside to find a humble abode with some pottery and strange objects on shelves. Morpheus heads for an open kitchen. I notice that his outfit is now displaying more white fabric than before. What an extravagant lord of dreams, I think. I think that he looks and sounds nothing like Lawrence Fishburne from The Matrix, but regard him as my Morpheus nonetheless, so I request the obvious for a reaction by saying, "You got any pills for me?" Morpheus opens a refrigerator, reaches for what I presume to be pills, and hands me 2 little sweets of a pale blue and red coloration. I take both. As I chew them, the taste reminds me of sugary tablets that my kids have offered me before. "Come and sit, my child," he says, leading me to a round table semi-surrounded by a padded couch. He sits down first and I reluctantly follow, suddenly becoming aware that remaining still for prolonged periods might end the experience. I rub my hands to maintain the realism, but feel like expressing my concern to what now feels like a profoundly wise character. "Morpheus, maybe I shouldn't sit. I could wake up." But Morpheus seems unconcerned. Instead, after briefly regarding me with oddly pale blue eyes and a furrowed brow betraying slight incredulity, the oniric lord gives me a cryptic reply. "You know, child, your sympathy knows no bounds." He looks away and begins to fade. I stop rubbing my hands as I begin to lack confidence in maintaining the lucid dream. I wake up satisfied with having met Morpheus. Waking state. I suppose I could re-enter the phase by lying still and waiting for imagery to come. But I hear my youngest son entering the room. I get ready for his remote lessons on the laptop. I record the experience on my smartphone. During the day, I remember that over Christmas my mother mentioned having watched the Merlin series, making me wonder if my Arthurian Morpheus partly originates from that conversation, which took place about 2 weeks ago. And that's the end of the experience. That's how I recorded it in my dream journal. And I also jotted down some goals for each state of consciousness. The waking state, go to bed earlier, which always helps when it comes to the induction of lucid dreams and OBEs. Dream state, record dreams and identify dream signs. And phase state, work on maintaining the phase state and execute the new plan of action. And my following plan of action would be 1. I always have enough steps in a plan of action in order to avoid hesitation in lucid dreamings, which can lead to a premature awakening. So I had written down 1, visit Titan, 2, eat some oysters, because I love oysters, and 3, lottery numbers. Try and get the winning numbers, and maybe that's another lucid dream that I could relate to you for another time. I can certainly let you know what happened with that one. I did look for the winning numbers, but I didn't get them. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I've gone on for quite a while now. I hope you got everything. I've mentioned the Fermi paradox, cosmic solitude, the problem of Moloch, dangerous ideas, and I think I've covered quite a lot. Projecting onto aliens, a kind of like a Jungian assessment of mankind, humankind as we now say it, gender neutral. And what we think aliens would be like. Talks about NDEs, lucid dreaming. I wanted to talk about Fichte, the philosopher Fichte, as I've been looking into him, and partly because I've had an argument with Felipe Bautista of the Ouroboros Idealism channel, and he's made some claims about Fichte which were incorrect. So I've also been researching Fichte, but I'm not going to mention it now because I've gone on for far too long. So talks about quantum physics, Romian mechanics. And I've also mentioned Besant and Ledbetter, and it's amazing. It's phenomenal, really. And I think next time I will be talking about the stuff that me and Stephen Wallard have been talking about recently, to do with people trying to refute idealism and making the same mistakes as materialism, and worse, because they are pointing to things in their models, in their theories, which they can't even falsify, and in fact they can't even point at anything to say that's what we mean, which is worse than the materialist, because the materialist at least can point at objects can point at matter and say, look, that's space-time, that's what we mean by the ontological primitive, which gives rise to our very existence, which gives rise to consciousness, which of course is a mistake. And they fail to realize that the very space-time they are referring to, the very objects that we perceive, are just evidence of percepts in mind. It's just evidence of mentation in the field of awareness. But anyway, I look forward to the course that my friend is working on at the moment, and it should set the record straight for a lot of people. Anyway, thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Experiential Realism. Thank you very much.